She was an Ethiopian of the best physical type. And her marriage with Moses may have been based upon a political motive. He even gives it up. Egyptian pharaohs from time to time allied themselves with the monarchs of the south, partly to obtain the aid of Ethiopian troops in their wars, partly with a view of claiming in right of their wives dominion over the upper Nile. So he's saying that he's admitting that the Egyptians married black women, Ethiopians. And they were not that they weren't black themselves. They reached back and got women from the south to marry these women. He says they were Ethiopians, but they weren't Negresses. Okay. So what we're talking about here is some black white people is what we're talking about. But I'm being emotional, and I want to latch on to somebody else's history. This is what he's teaching us. So he goes on, his madness continues on. But he goes on to talk about her. Amosi commemorated upon his monument during her son's reign. She held for a time, at any rate, the reign of power, while in after ages she was venerated as ancestress and founder of the 18th dynasty. In other words, she was seen as the ancestress, the founder of the entire 18th dynasty. Now, for those of you who don't know it, the 18th dynasty was the most brilliant period in Kemetic history. They built the most monumental structures in terms of temples and architecture that's ever been known in the world. Today, to this day, the great temple of Amun at Pt5, or Waret, which we call Karnak today, that's still today the largest temple in the world, built in the 18th dynasty, the most important aspects of it. So she was the ancestress of that entire dynasty. In his own words, the successor of Amosi was his son by this Ethiopian princess, Imhotep. So Imhotep was the son of this queen, the founder of the 18th dynasty. This is why she couldn't be a negress. So we move on. He goes on. This cat is something else. This is George Rawlinson. The Egyptians appear to have been among the darkest races with which the Greeks of the early times came into direct contact. Herodotus calls them blacks. But this is an extreme exaggeration akin to that by which all the native inhabitants of Hindustan have been termed niggers. Yeah, see? Have been termed niggers. The monuments show that the real complexion of the ordinary Egyptian man was brown with a tinge of red, a hue not very different from that of the Copt. This is psychopathic racism, madness. There's a man that's sitting here looking at black people. Look at yourself, brown, black, all different colors. It says that because you said we're exaggerating it when we call them black, because that's like calling everybody niggers or something, is what he's saying. But this is a scholar. This is an Egyptologist, a man who is renowned and respected in his craft as an Egyptologist. This is no lightweight. These are the guys that do the digging and do the writing, in which the historian comes over with a general view, takes his information, and then writes it into the history books. A Copt is another black person living in Egypt. That's basically it's a religion, the Coptic religion, and basically people call Copts as a result of that. But it's nothing no more than an extension and a reorganization of some earlier principles, really in Christianity, in the form of Christianity. Well, the basic cult of the Copt up until recently has been black and brown. And so he says they were. I'll show you that in a minute when we see Al-Jahites who back in Persia during the conquest of the Arabs. He clearly showed the Copts were also black. We move on. We can see here. In fact, here's Al-Jahites right here. Now, see, this is something because this is before the Aryan model. We're talking about around the 7th century, between the 7th century and the 12th century. You find that they uniformly saw the Egyptians even then as being black. And so this man here wrote a book called the Story of the Blacks Over the Whites, which at this time the whites were bragging and the Arabs were bragging about themselves. And so this man Al-Jahites, who became the father of Islamic literature, look it up in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Jahites wrote this book, The Glory of the Blacks Over the Whites. And in this particular book, he was defending his own self right in Persia, in the midst of all these people who were bragging. This is how much nerve this brother had, and this became the definitive work on the subject. He says the number of blacks is greater than the number of whites because most of those who are counted as whites are comprised of the people of Persia, the mountains, Khorasan, Rome, Slavia, France, and Iberia, and anything apart from them is insignificant. He goes on to say, but among the blacks, are the Copts. That's Jahit. He's black. In Persia, writing this, are the Copts, the Nubians, the Zakawa, the Moors, the people of the Zin, the Hindus, the Kamar, the Dabila, and the Chinese, and those beyond them. The sea is more extensive than the land, and the islands in the sea between China and the land of the Negroes are full of blacks. Here's a man who was traveled. He knew that the southeast part of Asia, which they called China in antiquity, and on into the Melanesian Islands and Papua New Guinea, all out in the South Pacific, was full of blacks. And this is what he's writing. He's putting all these people into the same class. And so this is, man, we're talking about way before the Aryan model came on the scene. So we move on. We can see Petrie, Flinders Petrie, writing in his book, Religion and Conscience, talking about the ruling race of the Egyptians. He says the ruling race is akin to the type of people of Punt. I showed you Punt with those mountains in the interior of Africa. The divine land. It seems most probable that the dynastic Egyptians entered the Nile Valley at Coptos from the Red Sea. He goes on, he says there's a Mesopotamian type there in Egypt also. He's digging up the archaeological finds here and the anthropological finds. He goes on to say, thirdly, there's a coarse type of mulatto appearance, and as it is certain anatomically that there is much Negro blood in the oldest Egyptians. We have one element of the mulatto in evidence. He's saying that, what is a mulatto? So he uses ambiguous terms. And how much is much Negro blood? How much is that? Is that you? How much Negro blood do you have as compared to a person in Zimbabwe, as a person in Uganda, as a person in Kenya? How much Negro blood do you have? Do you have much or do you have little? See, we got to start analyzing this psychopathic stuff these people have in these books. But nonetheless, he's seemingly admitting that at least 2/3 of the population that he was digging up here were clearly Africans. He had to say that because here's the findings. In the Quasi-Egyptian pre-dynastic tombs and early dynastic tombs, you can see here, these are all Nubians, the New Kingdom Nubians, C group Nubians, A group Nubians, B group Nubians, all Nubians, Abyssinians. The ancient Egyptians fit in the same category as all these Africans. Anatomically, they were the same. So this is what he was saying. So are we trying to latch on to somebody else's history, or are they trying to latch on to our history is the question. We ain't done yet. So Bernal goes on and writes, if Europeans were treating blacks, this is Mark Bernal in his Black Athena, if Europeans were treating blacks as badly as they did throughout the 19th century, blacks had to be turned into animals, or at best, subhumans. The noble Caucasian was incapable of treating other full humans in such ways. This inversion sets the scene for the racial and main aspect of the Egyptian problem. If it had been scientifically proved that blacks were biologically incapable of civilization, how could one explain ancient Egypt, which was inconveniently placed on the African continent? There are two, or rather three, solutions. First was to deny that the ancient Egyptians were black. The second was to deny that the ancient Egyptians had created a true civilization. And the third was to make doubly sure by denying both. The last has been preferred by most 19th and 20th century historians. They just deny both of them. But we all emotional and everything and trying to make up a civilization, trying to make up some history for ourselves. We move on. He goes on to state, this is Bernal continuing, as I stated in the introduction, I believe that the Egyptian civilization was fundamentally African, and that the African element was stronger in the Old and Middle Kingdoms before the Hyksos invasion than in later time, than it later became. Furthermore, I am convinced that many of the most powerful Egyptian dynasties, which were based in Upper Egypt, the 1st, 11th, 12th, and 18th, were made up of pharaohs whom one can usefully call black. This is Bernal. Okay, he's the grandson of Alan Gardner, who wrote the definitive work on the Egyptian language. Now, he didn't have no choice. In fact, he left out. I want to state, this is Bernal continuing, as I stated in the introduction, I believe that the Egyptian civilization was fundamentally African, and that the African element was stronger in the Old and Middle Kingdoms before the Hyksos invasion than in later time, than it later became. Furthermore, I am convinced that many of the most powerful Egyptian dynasties, which were based in Upper Egypt, the 1st, 11th, 12th, and 18th, were made up of pharaohs whom one can usefully call black. This is Bernal. Okay, he's the grandson of Alan Gardner, who wrote the definitive work on the Egyptian language. Now, he didn't have no choice. In fact, he even left out a few in between here. He got first. Well, what about the 4th and the 5th and the 6th and go on and on and on. We move on. But here's the 1st Here's the first king to unite Egypt as a nation, King Mena.